Once there was a young boy who, when he was still too small to know his own name, was placed in a garden. The garden teemed with life, and all of the creatures within its high walls were tame and kind to the boy. They assisted in raising him and were the only friends he had aside from the gardener. The gardener was not the master of the garden, but rather he was a caretaker, simply guiding it as it grew. This was true both for the boy and the garden, as the gardener always provided for the boy and made sure he had a good life. With the gardener as something akin to a father, the sun always shined and the water from the streams tasted sweet and refreshing. It was a land flowing with milk and honey, and often the gardener would come and walk and talk with the boy amongst the hills and the forests. Through the plains and the fields, they would converse about the beauty of the garden in the day, and they would talk of the stories of the stars overhead at night. It was a life of freedom, and the young boy had no rules save one. He was not to enter the maze at the center of the garden. The gardener never told him why this was forbidden. But the boy's life was well provided for, and so he asked for nothing and saw no reason to break this rule. And so the young boy spent his days in the garden. He wrestled with the bears in their fields, swam with the dolphins in the harbor, and sang with the birds of the air. And finally, every evening, he would have dinner with the gardener. They would talk and laugh far into the night, like a father and a son would, discussing how beautiful the glades, how the sun shines off the water, and how tame and kind the animals were. They would marvel for hours at the paradise they lived in. However, one day, as the boy lay napping in the fields with the big cats, he was awoken by a strange voice beckoning him to follow. The young boy tried to ignore it at first, but much like an itch that wouldn't go away, it tempted and tempted him until finally the boy awoke and followed out of curiosity. The boy knew every inch of the garden and gave names to every tree and animal. And for all this, the boy couldn't remember a strange voice ever being present. In staunch curiosity, the boy continued to follow. He pursued the forest over fen and field, through running stream and dark wood until finally he came to a part of the garden the boy had never dared to venture to before. The center. The boy had heard rumors from the birds of the air about how the center of the garden was the only place where trees were so dense that the light couldn't shine and nothing grew. However, they must have only been passing along rumors that they had heard and not what they had seen, because this was by far the most perfect part of the garden. There was no sunlight, and yet everything here seemed to emit its own light somehow, a strange luminescent glow. The grass was greener, the apples were brighter, and the sound of the crashing water in the nearby streams was muffled and quiet somehow. It was as if the boy had entered a strange, dreamlike state. His head felt light, and his arms felt fuzzy. Even the air was intoxicating in the same way that the wine the gardener brought to their dinners was. The boy's daze was quickly broken, however, by the same voice, beckoning him to delve deeper and deeper, until finally the boy came upon a great and terrible structure, the maze. The boy knew in his heart that he was not supposed to go in. It was the gardener's only rule. Everything and anything was permitted, save this. But still, the boy had lived in the garden for so long, he had recently begun to quietly wonder about what could possibly be hidden there. What could be so great that even the gardener would keep it from him? The voice then, almost as if it were able to hear his thoughts, asked him how it was possible that the gardener could love him or even trust the boy if he were keeping this one secret from him. The voice then suggested that perhaps the gardener was afraid that the boy would learn to build his own garden if he knew the secret that lay in the maze. The boy tried to shake these thoughts from his head, but slowly, as if moving out of their own volition, the boy's legs began to inch forward until finally he was on the threshold of the maze, a dark corridor with brutalist stone walls. If it wasn't for the precisely cut stone walls, it would resemble a cave more than a maze, a dark chasm from which no light seemed to escape. The intoxication of adventure gripped the boy's heart as the voice rang out from the maze, as if in pain, and the boy followed. The maze was eerily dark. It was not like the darkness of night in the garden. It felt older, somehow, and had a presence to it that the boy could not define. The walls inside the maze were smooth, the ceiling was high, and its floors were damp. For a moment, the young boy began to doubt his decisions, but just then, he had begun to hear music. It was low at first, and slowly began to rise and rise until it was an all-out symphony of the finest voices and instruments the boy had ever heard. It was far better than the gardener's music, and most interesting of all was that the voice from the maze was leading them in this wondrous hymn which boomed through the dark corridors. The boy, determined to find the source of this intoxicating music, followed the voice until finally the music stopped, and the boy found himself in an open room. The room had a singular beam of light breaking through the ceiling, slightly illuminating the rest of the room and landing on a wicked-looking altar adorned with a set of delicately sharp-looking knives. Aside from this, there was nothing else of interest in the room. Its brutalist stone walls were plain, and there was a simple, albeit deafening, pit in the center. The boy slowly made his way over to the pit and peered over the edge. To his surprise, there were animals, or what he thought were animals. The boy knew all the animals in the garden. He had named and befriended every single one, but these were unknown to him. They lay mangled in strange and unnatural angles. Many of their limbs were broken, their bones sticking out here or there, and in other cases their limbs were crushed altogether. The boy looked on in wonder until finally it dawned on him that these weren't animals like those in the garden. They were like him and the gardener. He looked closer and saw that the pit seemed to be filled with flies, buzzing and eating flesh from the humans. The boy scurried back from the edge in terror until his back hit the wall. He wanted to scream, he wanted to cry, but he was so shocked that all he could do was stare in horror. And finally, a voice broke his terrified silence. "I was worried when you didn't show up for dinner." It was the gardener. He stood in the doorway of the chamber across the room from the boy. "It's always the same. This happens every single time," he remarked with a deep sadness. What is this?" the boy was finally able to spit out. The gardener began to pace the room, seemingly ignoring the boy. Every single time I provide, I give you all anything you could possibly want for, and you always find your way here no matter what I do." He seemed sad and lonely. The boy repeated himself, more sternly now. "What is this? Why aren't they moving? Who are they?" The boy was yelling now, for what had to have been the first time in his life. The gardener sighed, as if this was some unfortunate inconvenience. "What they are is what I have been protecting you from," he paused. "They are death." "Death?" The word felt foreign in the boy's mouth. "When one ceases to be alive," the gardener said quickly. He was standing over the pit now. "We are not perfect beings, shadows of what our bastard father intended. We age, we grow, and one day we die. It is the way of the universe." He said this as if it were a matter of fact. The young boy was mortified. How could the gardener keep this from him? "What happens after we die?" the young boy asked desperately. "We used to have a place where we would go, where the toils of this world would fall away and one could rest without sigh or sorrow." He was beginning to rush now. "And that's what I tried to create for you here in the garden, a new Eden." He paused for a moment. "That's why I have to do this again and again. Every single time one of you discovers this pit, I have to do this. That was the deal." "The deal?" The boy was trembling now. "What deal?" The gardener was quiet for quite some time, and then began. "In the end, this is our father's fault, really. He dropped us here and he let us sin. He has the power to fix our mistakes, but he won't. He abandoned us to an imperfect world of pain and suffering, and that's why I had to beseech one of the lesser gods for help. If our father will not help us, I had to find someone who would." The gardener picked up a wicked-looking knife that almost sung as it cut through the air. He said he would create a small heaven on earth for us. If only I would sacrifice my children if ever they discovered the altar was holding it together. The gardener began to walk towards the boy. Don't you see? This is the price of utopia. There can be no heaven on earth without a great sacrifice. And surely the ends of heaven justify any means it takes to get there. The boy was crying now, a phenomenon he had never experienced. You don't understand what it's like outside the walls of the garden. You've never seen war. You've never seen sickness. You've never felt tired or hungry. And that's because I'm willing to do whatever it takes to ensure this paradise never falls. The boy was backed up against the wall now. His heart was beating in his chest so loudly it nearly drowned out the gardener. If you knew how terrible things could be, you would understand that I have to do this. I have to do whatever it takes to sustain this beacon of paradise. Men like me are necessary to achieve the greatest possible good. The blade was tracing the veins in the boy's neck, and the gardener was so close he was almost whispering. Surely you understand this, don't you?